Nobody ever looked twice at seat 12F. She was just a quiet passenger in 12F, silent, unnoticed, forgettable. Then two F-22 jets locked onto her flight, and command demanded her name. Her call sign made the F-22 pilots salute her right on the runway, and nothing about her stayed quiet. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. Margaret Hale sat in seat 12F with her hands folded on her lap. She was just a quiet passenger in 12F, nothing more. That is what everyone on Flight 2209 believed. She wore a plain gray sweater and simple black pants. Her silver hair was cut short and neat. She had a small paperback book open on her tray table, but she was not really reading it. She was watching the clouds move past the window, the way she always did on long flights. The flight from Denver to Washington, D.C. was supposed to be simple. 2 hours and 40 minutes in the air, a short layover, and then a quiet weekend visiting her niece. Margaret had booked this trip months ago. She had no idea that this ordinary Thursday afternoon would change everything. She had arrived at the airport early that morning, as she always did. Margaret liked airports for reasons she rarely explained to anyone. She liked the order of the lines, the steady rhythm of announcements, the sense that everyone around her was moving towards something. She had checked one small suitcase, kept her carry-on light, and found a quiet corner near her gate where she could sit with a cup of coffee and watch planes taxi across the runway. Most people never noticed her. She preferred it that way. Being unnoticed had once been a survival skill, back when her work required her to blend into rooms full of important people without drawing attention to herself. That habit had never fully left her, even in retirement. Boarding had gone smoothly. She found her seat, tucked her small bag beneath the seat in front of her, and settled in with the paperback book she had bought at a used bookstore near her home. It was a mystery novel, the kind of story with slow chapters and quiet clues, the sort of book she liked precisely because it never rushed toward danger. She had enough danger in her memories already. She did not need it in her fiction. The man next to her, a young salesman named Kyle, had tried to make small talk during boarding. He asked her where she was headed and what she did for a living. Margaret had smiled politely and said she was retired. She did not say what she used to do. She never did. For 20 years, she had learned that some answers were better left unspoken, even to strangers who meant no harm. At 31,000 feet, the plane was calm. The flight attendants moved through the aisle with the drink cart. A baby cried somewhere near the back, then settled down. Kyle had fallen asleep with his headphones on. Margaret looked out the window again and noticed something strange. A shadow crossed the wing, fast and sharp, gone before she could be sure of what she saw. Minutes later, passengers near the windows began to whisper and point. Margaret leaned forward slightly and saw it clearly this time. A gray fighter jet, sleek and angular, was flying alongside the plane. Its wings barely moved as it matched the airliner's speed with perfect precision. Another one appeared on the opposite side moments later. Two F-22 Raptors, one of the most advanced fighter jets ever built, were now flying escort with a commercial passenger plane. The cabin buzzed with nervous energy. Phones came out. People pressed against the windows to take pictures. Kyle woke up from the noise and rubbed his eyes before staring out past Margaret at the jet close enough to see the pilot's helmet. An older man across the aisle asked loudly if this meant something was wrong with the plane. A teenager 2 rows back was already recording video, narrating in a hushed and excited whisper for whoever might watch it later online. A mother near the front pulled her son away from the window, unsure whether to be worried or amazed. The energy in the cabin shifted from boredom to something closer to fear mixed with wonder, the kind of feeling that spreads quickly through a group of strangers sharing the same small space at the same altitude. Margaret remained still through all of it. She did not lean toward the window like the others. She did not reach for her phone. She simply watched, calm and steady, the way a person watches something they understand completely while everyone around them is seeing it for the very first time. "Is that normal?" he asked her, his voice shaking a little. Margaret did not answer right away. She was studying the aircraft with an expression that Kyle did not notice, but a sharp observer would have. Her eyes moved across the jet the way a mechanic studies an engine, not the way a tourist admires a view. She recognized the tail markings. She recognized the formation pattern. This was not a random escort. This was a planned intercept, and someone had ordered it for a reason. The captain's voice came over the speaker, calm but careful. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We have military aircraft alongside us as part of a routine procedure. There is nothing to worry about." His voice did not sound entirely convinced of his own words. Margaret closed her paperback book and set it down. She glanced at her watch, an old steel model with a scratched face, a gift from a time she rarely spoke about anymore. The minutes passed slowly. The jets held their position, matching every small movement of the airliner with practiced ease. Margaret noticed the lead pilot glance toward the passenger windows more than once, as if searching for something or someone. A flight attendant named Denise walked down the aisle, checking on passengers and trying to keep everyone calm. When she reached row 12, she paused. She looked at Margaret for a long moment, then leaned down. "Ma'am, I have an unusual request," Denise said quietly. "The captain has been asked to confirm if there is a passenger named Hale on board." "Is that you?" Margaret felt something settle in her chest, a mix of memory and quiet dread. She nodded once. "Yes. That's me." Denise's eyes widened slightly. "The lead pilot is requesting to speak with you directly. He says it's urgent. Would you come with me to the front of the plane?" The cabin had gone unusually quiet. Passengers near her seat turned to look, whispering among themselves. Kyle stared at her with his mouth slightly open, unsure what to think of the woman who had seemed so ordinary just an hour earlier. Margaret stood up, smoothed her sweater, and walked down the aisle with steady steps. She had walked down aisles like this before, though not for a very long time. The years of civilian life had softened the sharp edges of her old habits, but they had not erased them completely. Old instincts returned quickly, like an old coat pulled from the back of a closet. At the front of the plane, the captain waited near the cockpit door. He was a tall man in his 50s with tired eyes and a calm manner that came from years of experience. "Ma'am, I apologize for the interruption," he said. "The lead pilot outside has authorization codes that check out through military channels. He is asking to speak with you on a secure radio line. Are you willing to take the call?" Margaret nodded. "Yes, Captain. I am." He handed her a headset. Her fingers moved to the switch with practiced ease, the same motion she had made hundreds of times many years before. She pressed the button and spoke into the microphone. "This is Hale," she said simply. There was a short pause on the line, filled with static. Then a voice came through, young but respectful. "Ma'am, this is Falcon 2-6. I need to verify your identity. Can you confirm your former call sign and your last assigned unit?" The captain and the first officer exchanged a glance. They could not hear the other side of the conversation, but they could see the change in Margaret's posture. Her shoulders straightened. Her chin lifted slightly. The tired retiree who had boarded the plane in Denver seemed to disappear, replaced by someone else entirely. "Call sign was Hawkeye," Margaret said clearly. "Last assignment, 94th Fighter Squadron, Systems Testing Division." Another pause, longer this time. When the pilot spoke again, his tone had shifted completely. "Copy that, Hawkeye. It is an honor, ma'am. We have an emergency situation involving avionics failures across several active squadrons. Command believes you may be the only person with the specific knowledge needed to help us understand the problem. We are requesting an immediate diversion to Joint Base Andrews for a full briefing." Margaret closed her eyes for a moment. 20 years had passed since she left active service. 20 years of quiet mornings, garden work, and long walks that were supposed to be enough to fill the space that flying had once occupied. She had told herself she did not miss it. Standing in that cockpit doorway, headset pressed to her ear, she realized how much of a lie that had been. "I understand," she said. "I will cooperate fully." The captain made the necessary calls to air traffic control. Minutes later, the plane began a gentle turn, changing course toward Andrews Air Force Base instead of its scheduled destination. An announcement was made to the cabin, brief and vague, explaining only that there had been a change in plans due to operational reasons. Passengers whispered and speculated, but none of them knew the full truth. None of them understood that the ordinary woman from Seat 12F held knowledge that could protect the entire fleet of advanced fighter jets currently in the sky. When the plane landed at Andrews, a black sedan was already waiting on the tarmac. Margaret gathered her small bag and walked down the steps of the aircraft into the warm afternoon air. Two F-22 pilots in flight suits stood beside the car, the same two who had flown escort with her plane only an hour earlier, and when they saw her approaching, they did something that made the surrounding ground crew pause in their work. They stood straight, brought their hands to their foreheads, and held a formal salute. It was her own call sign, spoken over the radio just hours before, that made the F-22 pilot salute her the moment her feet touched the ground. Margaret returned the salute with the same precision she had used decades earlier, muscle memory guiding her hand without hesitation. It had been a long time since anyone had greeted her this way. It felt strange and familiar at the same time, like putting on an old uniform that somehow still fit. She was driven directly to a secure building on base, where a briefing room had already been prepared. Officers and engineers sat around a long table, papers and screens showing data she recognized instantly. The problem, they explained, involved a rare and dangerous fault in the sensor systems of several F-22 jets, a fault that had appeared only under specific high-altitude conditions. The engineers who had originally designed parts of that system had either retired, moved to private companies, or passed away. Margaret was one of the few people alive who understood the original architecture well enough to identify what might be going wrong. For the next several hours, Margaret worked alongside the team, reviewing data, asking pointed questions, and slowly guiding them toward an answer that had eluded everyone else. She recognized a pattern that no one else had noticed, a small inconsistency buried deep within layers of code that had been updated many times over the years without anyone fully understanding the original design choices behind it. It was the kind of detail that only someone who had built the system from the ground up would recognize. At one point, a young engineer named Priya slid a tablet across the table, showing Margaret a graph of sensor readings collected during the last failure. Margaret studied it carefully, tracing the pattern with her finger the way she used to do decades earlier with paper printouts instead of digital screens. She noticed that the failures always occurred a few seconds after the aircraft crossed a certain altitude while turning at a specific angle. It was subtle, easy to miss unless someone was looking for exactly that kind of pattern. "This is not a hardware failure," Margaret said, sitting back in her chair. "This is a timing conflict between two systems that were never meant to run this particular calculation at the same moment. It was likely introduced during one of the later software updates, probably one that combined two older subsystems without fully testing how they behaved together under load." Colonel Briggs looked at his team, then back at Margaret. "Is that something we can fix quickly?" "Yes," Margaret said. "Once you know where to look, it becomes a matter of adjusting the timing sequence, not rebuilding anything. I can walk your engineers through the exact section of the system that needs review." The room seemed to exhale at once, tension breaking into quiet relief. Priya thanked her twice, and one of the senior engineers admitted that his team had spent 3 full days chasing the wrong explanation before Margaret arrived. Margaret only nodded, feeling a familiar satisfaction that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with simply solving a problem that mattered. By evening, the team had identified the source of the problem and outlined a plan to correct it across every affected aircraft. Colonel Briggs, the officer leading the investigation, thanked her personally, his gratitude clear on his tired face. "You saved us weeks of guessing, ma'am," he said. "Maybe longer. We are grateful you were willing to help." Margaret smiled, feeling a tiredness that was different from the quiet boredom of her retired life. This tiredness felt earned. It felt useful. "I am glad I could be of service," she said simply. Later that night, as she sat in the guest quarters provided for her on base, Margaret thought about the strange turn her ordinary Thursday had taken. She had woken up that morning thinking only about her niece's dinner plans and the paperback book in her bag. She had not expected fighter jets, secure briefings, or the return of a call sign she had not used in 20 years. Yet here she was, and something inside her felt lighter than it had in a very long time. The next morning, before she continued her journey to her niece's home, 2 young pilots came to see her before their shift. They were the same pilots who had flown escort with her plane the day before. They stood at attention in the hallway outside her room, uncertain but eager. "Ma'am," one of them said, "we wanted to say it was an honor to fly with you yesterday, even if you didn't know it at the time." He hesitated, then added, "When command told us who was on that flight, we couldn't believe it. Ghost stories about Hawkeye have been passed around test squadrons for years. We didn't think you were real." Margaret laughed softly, a genuine and warm sound. "I assure you, I am very real. Just older, and much quieter these days." The pilot smiled, then straightened once more, and it was her own call sign that made the F-22 pilots salute her a second time before they turned and headed off toward their aircraft. Margaret stood in the hallway a moment longer, watching them go, feeling the weight of the moment settle over her. She had spent 20 years trying to disappear quietly into an ordinary life, believing that part of her was gone for good. Yet all it had taken was one flight, one radio call, and one small crisis to prove that some skills, and some people, never truly retire. They simply wait for the moment they are needed again. As she finally boarded her connecting flight to continue her original trip, Margaret took her seat by the window once more. She opened her paperback book, though she still did not read it. Instead, she watched the sky, the same sky she had once known so well from the other side of a cockpit glass. She smiled quietly to herself, thinking that perhaps she was not finished with that sky just yet. Perhaps the quiet years had only been a pause, not an ending. Her niece met her at the arrivals gate later that evening, waving from behind the crowd with a bright smile that had not changed since she was a little girl. "How was the flight, Aunt Margaret?" she asked, pulling her into a warm hug. "Anything interesting happen?" Margaret considered the question for a long moment, thinking of the jets, the radio call, the salute on the tarmac, and the quiet pride she had felt walking through that briefing room again after so many years. "Nothing much," she said finally, a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Just a quiet flight." Her niece laughed and looped an arm through hers, leading her toward the parking garage, completely unaware of everything that had happened 30,000 feet above the clouds. Margaret glanced back once toward the runway, where planes continued to take off and land in an endless, familiar rhythm. Somewhere out there, engineers were already adjusting the timing sequence she had identified, and 2 young pilots were likely telling their friends about the flight where they had escorted a legend without knowing it. Margaret turned back toward her niece, content in the knowledge that some parts of a life never truly retire. They simply wait, quietly, for the moment they are called upon again, and somewhere far above the clouds, in squadrons she would never fully leave behind, her name was already being spoken again with the kind of respect that only comes from those who understand exactly what it means to have once been called Hawkeye.